Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to another session of the Doctor's Lab, where today we'll be looking at classical solutions, for contemporary problems. So I got tongue twister there, almost. Right. And before we jump into someone says salam, my brother Dr. Khalid Green, Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
How you doing, my brother?
I'm doing fine. Excuse me. It's always a pleasure to be back and come back to the Doctor's Lab, a place
Likewise.
of academic refuge, I guess.
MashaAllah, definitely, and I think just engaging with you as my brother, MashaAllah, and Doctor on issues that are pertinent to us today, MashaAllah, tabarakallah. And I think today, brother Khalid, classical solutions for contemporary problems. Now, this title, what is it you have in mind to kickstart this particular discussion?
Basically, I thought it was an extension of what we talked about prior, and that it's very important for us to realize a lot of our contemporary issues that we deal with as Muslims and even non-Muslims, that Islam has that solution. Now, that can be looked at by some as, they think that's a blanket statement. It's just the general statement. Okay, it's the catch-all. Islam has a solution. Salafi Dawah, it has a solution. That's it. But I think we have to look and understand what is meant by that. Is it that Islam has detailed every single aspect in our life and new scenarios that we have, or does it give us the framework? And does the Dawah and scholarship give us the framework? So basically, these are some of the things that I think we need to kind of unpackage. That, hey, we have classical scholarship and we have Islam, which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has perfected for us and perfected and given us as a ni'mah and a favor to us, and that we have to operate from Islam in dealing with all of our contemporary issues.
Jazakallah khair. And I obviously I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think to set the tone, and wa alaikum salam, Sister Kira, Sister Malahat, good to see you here, and yes, nice to have you here, mashallah. B, wa alaikum salam to you as well, mashallah. And Dominic, good to hear from you, good to see you with us. Now, Ibn al-Qayyim said in A'lamul Muwafaqeen, okay, volume 2 and 4.
إعلام مواقعين. No.
MashaAllah. I got the last part right with the pronunciation, but you with the Lisan and Arab will be having the better pronunciation, MashaAllah. But he says here, whoever considers the trials and discords that have come upon Islam, the small and the great of them, will realize that they were due to abandoning the principle of not being hasty and having patience, sabr, upon which is harmful, and seeking to remove the harm in a hasty manner. This in turn produces that which is greater and worse than the initial harm. So trying to remove a harm in a manner that is hasty, as we see many of the youth, many of those today doing without knowledge, not looking at the classical solutions, has only perpetuated or worsened, exacerbated the harm that they were trying to remove in the first place. And then we see from Imam Jamaluddin al-Qasimi, who also said, from what is well known about that which occurs when people gather together upon some matter, is that any group which becomes strong and has many followers, you will definitely find in them the pure and the impure, the justly balanced and the imbalanced, the extreme and the moderate. And a well-established fact is that the extremists are more vocal and of greater acceptance, since the ones who are balanced follow a middle course. And those who seek this balanced approach are few in number, in every age and place. As for extremism, then this is what most people thrive upon, and what the overwhelming majority incline towards. Now, when we're talking about extremism here, I think Imam Qasimi, we're not just talking about the Kharijites. We have to talk about what you and I have been discussing for weeks now and months. And that's that polarization societally of extremism from one way to the to one side to the other side. And we find that there's a distortion, and that distortion has become the norm. okay, where the masses are looking at two polarized perspectives, and we can see that in the way that many of us engage online as well. And that the middle way, which is the moderate way, is frowned upon, almost as if the moderate way is the strange way. And that ties into classical solutions from the perspective I'm looking at, where the Prophet ﷺ drew that line in the sand, and the divergent lines on either side of that line. And he said, this is my straight path. And he drew the lines on the alternative, those lines on the divergent sides. He said, and these are the sides of misguidance. So what I've just described fits in with that prophetic narration and what the classical solution was, which is what we say in our prayers 17 times a day at least. Ihdina sirat al-mustaqim. That line, that straight line being the sirat al-mustaqim. So elaborate a bit more upon what you said earlier and what I've just expounded upon now, Brother Khalid, please.
No. So as you rightly said, and you came up with the interesting thing is, I looked at the book, the I'lam Muwaqqi'in, which is a very big book in the Arabic. Is, like, I don't know, about 6-7 volumes. Of Sheikh Salim al-Halali did the tahqiq. Anyway, so anyhow, I was actually looking because I knew Ibn al-Qayyim, he has spoke extensively about some of these, about, just the perfection of Islam and the importance of Tawheed and patience being a foundation for dealing with everything. So I was actually looking for some quotes. So I'm very glad you brought up that, because I couldn't find anything. It would take actually researching the Arabic and really going in, and it was going to be a big project. So that's an excellent quote. And as far as what you're saying, as we have been talking about this a lot, that there are those extremes, and both extremes are leaving the Surat, leaving the correct way and the correct balance and the correct understanding, as the Prophet ﷺ mentioned. And in that regard, the Prophet ﷺ was talking about different methodologies, different creeds that would, different types of deviancy from the straight path. He said that, that this is the straight path, and then he drew on the right and he drew on the left, and he said, Hadihi subul, these are the paths. Wa ala kulli sabil fiha shaytan, and at every head there is a shaitan calling to it. So in light of what we're talking about, we see, and we've talked about it as well, as far as progressive extremism, right? Which, yes, it seems for them, it would seem like I don't know if a misnomer is the right word, but that it contradicts that. But in fact, in relation to Islam, it is an extremism. And in fact, you'll find that they, in some respects, because they're wanting to dismantle Islamic tenets and Islamic foundations and what have you, that they leave the fold of Islam. Whereas the Khawarij, the extremists, the violent extremists, generally are still within the bounds of Islam. There, of course, there's right. some discussion about that, and some scholars, and even classic scholars, some of them from the narrations, make takfir of like those extremists. And that's why some scholars, I think Sheikh Shitri, when ISIS kind of emerged, he said that they're disbelievers. He came out in public media. He said they are not even Muslim. Yeah. So I remember seeing that. So yeah, as you said, there's always this polarization, and Islamically, we're really focused on the important balance, which is based on the Quran and the Sunnah, and as Sheikh Salih bin Fawzan, he mentions about the concept of extremism or being extreme as a term, ghulu, as one of the terms for extremism. And he says it means tajawuz al-had. It means to go beyond the bound. So when you see, if that straight path is like this, here's the sirat al-mustaqim, or the straight path, as the Prophet ﷺ drew it. That's right. Going to the right is going beyond the bounds. If you go to extreme, like the extremists, the violent extremists, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and these guys, to this way, or if you go this way, you become so moderate and so accommodating that you just destroy and undermine so many Islamic foundations from a creed. They're both a type of extremism. They both went beyond the bounds.
And I think you meant not moderate, you meant liberal, because you said moderate, and moderate is what
sorry.
mashallah.
Well,
But
you know, the funny thing is, and those are terminologies. They will use it and say, you know, I'm a
yes,
moderate Muslim.
they would.
Whenever you hear somebody say they're a moderate Muslim, you almost, you know, there's usually that kind of association. Well, I'm a moderate Muslim, usually meaning that I might pray sometimes. You know, I may usually fast Ramadan. I've kind of, you know.
And that's an important thing that you said. That I'm glad you highlighted that, because what we see as well, we see that in when the Sunnah and Salafiyah was being expounded to the degree it was during the 90s, late 90s and the early noughties, we saw the Sufi movement start referring to themselves as the traditionalists. We are the traditionalists. Exactly, and meaning that we're the ones who have got the traditions based on their ideology. So that's very important that you highlighted that. Terminology is something we've got to be very, very specific on today, because stating something can mean the exact opposite, for example, or it could obscure the reality of who and what you are. Now, before we continue, there's what you're saying there, we're sticking with the Siras and Mustaqim and these divergent paths. I'd just like to share and highlight a series of talks, three parts from our beloved brother, yours and mine, who we both know very, very well, Abdullah Luxi, Abdullah from Luxembourg, because I was listening to, and I hope Hassan can find the link because it was done on Stream Islam during Ramadan, Breaking Out of the Matrix. And I was listening to it. It's a 3-part. I listened to it 2 days ago. And what he speaks about and the way he delivers that short discourse, each short discourse, as I said, I've only heard part 1. I found it very profound. And I would urge the viewers, the listeners, to listen to, you know, he delivers in a very, mashallah, attractive way. But I would urge the viewers to listen to Breaking Out of the Matrix. The Matrix, as he describes, all of those temptations and all of those polarizations outside of us. And the fitra, and natural fitra, being internal, and that being what we should incline towards. But these various polarizations, these various distractions are pulling us away from our fitra. So I think that will tie in very nicely with what we're speaking about today, Brother Khalid. Now, what I would say as well, I want to come from another angle, that some of the challenges that we have to look at today. So, for example, one of the books that I've read, I mentioned before the show, on authoritarianism in Islam. I'll give the exact title a little bit later. But the author notes here, and how do we deal with this when we're talking about classical solutions for contemporary problems? 2/3 of all wars and about 1/3 of all minor military conflicts in 2009 occurred in Muslim majority countries. That's a glaring factor that needs to be acknowledged. He also mentioned here, Muslim majority countries have also experienced disproportionate rates of authoritarianism, which is a major factor leading to violence. Okay, now these are things here. Why is this happening? What is the classical solution for this problem? Why aren't they being adhered to? If we have Islam, which we do, as that foundation. And Jazakallah khair, Hassan's just put up the link for Abdullah Luxi's discourse, his lectures. So these statistics here, there's the link there. And I urge viewers to get that and watch that, inshallah. These are things that we need to look at. We've got, as we saw emerge, and we've spoken about it many months ago, I discussed the Ulama State Alliance, okay? How the Ulama in the past, and it's continued to a degree, are aligned with the state. And we're not saying anything's wrong with that, but was that part of, or can that be part of the discourse where we are looking at classical solutions for contemporary problems? Many would argue yes, and there's precedents that are there to support that. And I'm not saying that we dive into that particular aspect, because there's so many political dynamics and areas to look at there. But I'm talking from a historical perspective. We look at the Ottoman Empire, for example, and you saw some ulama state alliances. You see that in other leadership structures that are actually there. So when we're talking about classical solutions now, does that mean, as I looked in my theoretical frameworks, that, let's say, Salafiyah, in this contemporary time, do we as Salafis, the Salafism, I won't say us as Salafis, let's talk about Salafism, because Salafis, we've acknowledged that there are issues of non-adherence in some respects because of various factors. But when we're looking at Salafism, Salafiyah, from a societal perspective, and I'm talking, let's look from where we are, from a Western perspective at the moment, where we emanate from. Does that have all of the solutions pragmatically, practically, comprehensively? And I'll stop when I've explained my theoretical framework, the funnel theory, as you know, that I put out there. Had, if you imagine the funnel and you imagine the pressure and gravitational pull towards an extreme, violent extremism in this particular instance, getting stronger as you go further down the funnel. And at the top of the funnel is where there's less pressure and almost no pressure, that's very, very weak and flaccid, if you like. And I've placed at that top of the funnel, let's say, progressive or liberal Islam, or and I call it liberal extremism, as you do in our studies. And as the gravitational pull gets stronger, it pulls into a more violent extreme. But along the way, as you traverse that funnel, as you move down that funnel, there are different actors. So moving away from that very flaccid, loose gravitational pull at the top, you'll move down and you'll have some more liberal, moderate, coming to the Muslim Brotherhood type politicized understanding that is there. Then you come further down, not meaning that you're becoming extreme, but where the gravitational pull is strongest, you get to the neck of the funnel before that pulling into extremism. And at that neck of the funnel, you have orthodox communities that are the ones that are halting that gravitational pull or causing a reflux from that gravitational pull. And I say that Salafist communities are there, being right at the heart, at the neck of where the problem ideologically in society lies. And they're either halting that gravitational pull or combating that pull as it continues down. And as I've mentioned, in some instances, causing a reflux. Those who are coming up from that settle, understanding now the balance of theology and what Salafism actually is. So I'm saying again, so I make it clear, is Salafism in a Western context suitable at the theological foundational stage of society? But when it comes to social aspects, I mean, and I say social, not exclusively, but other more societal avenues, is it as effective there as it is in theology, ideology, clarity, combating extremism? Is it as effective? I'm not saying it can't be, but is it now?
I mean, I think that comes down to really the practice of the, of Salafis in those particular societies, and I think a lot of these are what are known as fiqh nawazil, like new contemporary issues. These are new issues, and I talked about this in my research that basically we're trying to find our place in these societies, okay, and dealing with these new issues. These new issues are not just textbook clear in that sense, but there are foundational principles and so forth that should guide us. And that's really what the Salafi Dawah is, and should be, is that we're holding on to those principles, we're holding on to our creed, and the fiqh, the ijtihadat. This is something the scholarly striving to come up with an Islamic ruling, is within that context, in regardless of what society, whether you're in a desert tent, whether you're in a complex democracy or whatever you want to call it in the US or in the UK or, the various political systems. So I think we're trying to find our place and trying to, because the reality is not everyone's going to be able to make hijrah, and, the practicality. And we had some discussions, and actually I put some of our discussions in my book as well. I said, Dr. Haqq Baker was asked about hijrah, and I quoted you actually about how, in the 90s and how that was a big push for that. So anyhow, and in general, I think a lot of the as far as the solutions, a lot of it comes to our shortcomings, and that's going to always be the case. We're human beings. Societies are not going to be perfect. My idea of one of the best societies to live in as a practicing Muslim who believes in the book and the Sunnah would be Saudi Arabia. And with all of its problems and issues, it's far from perfect. But there are some very important foundations that are inherent in their society that are in accordance with the book and the Sunnah, which is so important. But again, we all have shortcomings, and and this is the nature of human beings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us in toil, and that we would be toiling and we would be struggling, and we're not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be, things are going to be implemented with perfection, but it's really finding how to approach those solutions. And again, it's so important to have, because this goes to something, and I even quoted and dealt with this in my research, where Yasser Qadhi was criticizing Salafis and so forth like this in the Dawah. And he was saying it's impractical to have basically one of these classic solutions. The Salaf never even heard of those things. And I thought that was strange, because this is a man who studied a lot of, not just the Dawah, but he's got a lot of scholarship and is very well versed in secular knowledge and what have you. He's a smart guy. But I thought that was, to me, that was very strange, that you wouldn't realize, the whole, it's almost like a lack of acknowledgement to me, the whole body of fiqh that, they're dealing, the fiqh that is developing and has been developing throughout history. They're developing based on rules and principles, trying to determine what is pleasing to Allah or what is in conformity with Islam. And a benefit, I remember Sheikh Suleiman al-Rahili, he said, or it's in a book, or a more recent book he put out in the past couple of years, and he was talking about ruling by other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed. And we know all the controversy with that. And that's what this is also, it's relevant to our discussion, because this has to do with our relationship in a democratic society and many, many things. And anyhow, what he mentioned there that I thought was a faida that stuck with me is that, it's about not contradicting the shara, not going against, so there's a lot of lucidity in the sense that, for example, traffic laws. Well, the scholars, they look to that. So we could say someone who's ignorant would say, that's not in the Sharia, or, why am I getting a ticket for a traffic ticket, and this is from a Muslim government. They're ruling by whether other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed. That's an extreme case, but we know a lot of people have ideas like this. But the point is those contemporary issues, they are within the context that the Imam, as the classical scholars talked about, has that right, as long as it doesn't contradict the shara. Traffic and driving, this is something that's normally mubah. It's something that's permissible. So there's no hukum, there's no ruling pertaining to it. Making a ticket and punishing someone because they were speeding, this is the ruler's right, and this comes under, I forget the name of the principle, but anyhow, it comes under the ruler's right, and it's not about ruling and adjudicating other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed. It's within the context, it's within the power that the Sharia has given the ruler, because he's not making a hukum shar'i that goes against what Allah said or His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said. So I hope that's kind of clear. But
no, exactly. And I think that speaks to one of the other books I read a while ago, Introduction to Sharia and Muslim Minorities, speaking about this again. And what was highlighted here, which was interesting, the fiqh of Muslim minorities, religio-juristic heritage, the field of jurisprudence, fiqh, that examines the legitimacy of voluntary modern migration to and residence in non-Muslim societies, and addresses specific everyday challenges that Muslim minorities confront, is called fiqh al-aqaliyat al-muslima.
Fiqh al-aqaliyat, no.
Yes, this field draws from the juristic heritage that developed in relation to previous minority conditions, while struggling to resolve dilemmas that have not yet been treated by jurists of the past. So finding that context as what you've just spoken to is something that I think is very important when we're looking at the classical solutions. We're living in a time where, as a minority in the West, the Muslims form a huge populace, and this is unprecedented in Islam, where so many Muslims are living as minorities abroad. So one of the things we've seen from the progressives, and one of the things we've seen from the Khariji extremists, is, on the one hand, there's a dilution of classical, authentic, orthodox dictates Islamically. And unfortunately, that's crept into some of the more moderate, balanced understandings that are there. And then at the other extreme, as we saw with ISIS and others, there's that call to return to that age, that particular understanding, but it's a miscontextualized, distorted call. And we've got to be very clear on this, because when we see that extremity, some will then say, but Salafis are in line with that, which is not true. And if there are those who are calling themselves Salafis saying, yes, there's a close alignment to what they're calling to, then they're mistaken. Because we know that with Salafism, we know that with Islam, if we want to say, for a more general focus, that this is a deen that is for every time and place and context and construct. So we need to really tease out how those extremes can sort of interfere with the moderate, balanced perspective if we are unassuming, or we are unaware, or we are ignorant of what is actually that straight path and that knowledge and what protects that. Because that's what's happening. The confusion that's taking place, where some are saying Khuruj is okay and bringing statements to that, where others are saying it's okay to immerse yourself in a complete democratized understanding, is problematic, because again, both serve to either distort or dilute what is the Sirat al-Mustaqim, what is the middle way. And now, while we're talking on democratization, Brother Khalid, I want to throw this over to you, because you studied it. When we see that narrative that Islam is in of sorts a type of democracy, you hear Muslims. I went to a conference, I don't want to say where, in a Muslim country, mashallah, and one of the practitioners was saying, and he's from the Sunnah, which I made me think about, and he wasn't a scholar, but he was saying there is a type of democracy in Islam. He used that phrase, and I was like, interesting. Why is he saying that? And he explained that. Now, I know in my PhD, in my introductory chapters, I speak about the process of elections that took place in Brixton, okay? And where I subsequently became chairman. And I mentioned that the community had gathered. There was a lot of turmoil. We call it Black Sunday, 1993 it was. And everyone gathered, and there were all sorts of people in there, okay? And what was decided by the two of the imams at that time, Sheikh Saleh, rahimahullah, Sheikh Salah, sorry, rahimahullah, and I've said, look, what should happen? People should vote here for individuals that they want to be leaders. And then amongst those people that you have voted for, they will go away into a room and choose amongst themselves who would be the leaders. And we did that. Myself, Brother Talib, Abu Safia, another one of our brothers, Hafidahullah, were selected amongst them. Surat Abdul Malik, Rahimahullah, Abu Sufyan, Abdul Karim Madar was selected. And also amongst them was one of those, Abdul Malik Trinidadi, who was on the Dal Harb kind of understanding. He was the only one who was selected by the rest of the crowd as well, who was non-Salafi in there. So it was almost a foregone conclusion that that group, which was about 4 or 5 Salafis and 1 non-Salafi, were going to select a Salafi. Is that a democratization of sorts? And the reason I'm asking that, Brother Khalid, because we see that after the death of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sahaba, we saw that the Quraysh went and met with the Ansar, who were meeting to decide who was going to be the next leader, the Khalifa, the first Khalifa. Okay, and discussion ensued between the Ansar and the Quraysh. And prophetic narrations came about that the Quraysh will come from the Khalifa would come from the Quraysh, and then that was acknowledged, okay, and accepted by most, and not really accepted in the first instance by a minority, 1 or 2, from what I recall of the account, but it was acknowledged, and therefore what happened amongst them, then the Khalifa was elected, and it, as we know with history, it was Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So coming back to my question, I brought a contemporary perspective of how we selected a chairman in Brixton Mosque, based on our knowledge and observation of that account, that historic account of the first Khalifa. Not that those positions were synonymous. The chairmanship is nothing. Yes, as Brummy guy saying, that's Shura. Absolutely. And this is what I want to ask you, Khalid. Shura, as Allah tells us in the Quran about having Shura, there are some who are explaining that Shura is a democracy using today's language of sorts. Please elucidate upon that.
Well, what I came across, because this is something, I tried to explore some of those questions in my research, and as the person who commented so rightly said, there's a difference between shura and then really democracy, and so I actually had to go. It's again about definitions. So I had to go, and even Western democracies define democracy different, and there's so many different definitions. So I had to choose a definition. I think it might have been something that the UN has, something that was kind of a superseded many other definitions, and certain principles are associated with, like, elections and certain freedoms and stuff like this, free speech, freedom of the press, and free whatever. So there are those groups, and I think this is where you have such a big difference between Salafis especially, and I would also argue that groups that are those extremist groups, as you mentioned, ISIS and stuff, there is things they share in that they all reject what is considered democracy, modern concepts of democracy. In my studies, all the scholars that I can think of, the big name scholars, all speak very harshly against democratic systems, except that they say that, for example, Muhammad Aman Ajami, rahmatullahi alayhi, mentions that it's better than a communist system or those kind of systems, for Muslims, there's more freedom to propagate Islam and so on and so forth. So what you have is it comes down to definitions. And what you have also from like modern progressive movements and even Ikhwan Muslimin and others is they will say, because of shura in the Sharia, they make it synonymous with democracy. So then that's their whole, a big part of their minhaj, their methodological push is that, hey, Khalas, democracy. Let me give you a little piece of my research. So democracy as a political system is highly contested by both Muslim and non-Muslim proponents. Salafis, to say the least, are highly suspicious of democracy and any political system they perceive to be in contradiction to Islam. Also, the other groups like Al-Qaeda, those other groups, I mean, those are things that we share overlapping. But as far as the extremism and the violence, this is where we definitely depart. In addition, they are highly skeptical of the integrity of an electoral system. Okay. Bin Uthaymeen states, those who call to democracy in the West and around the world do not implement it. They are liars. Even their elections involve rigging and deception. They only consider their whims important. In Islam, when the informed decision makers agree upon allegiance to an imam, then he becomes imam regardless of whether the lay persons agree or not. So Bin Uthaymeen kind of lays it out that Islam is not about everyone having an opinion and everyone having a choice. And so this is where, yes, I don't like to say that, but in a sense, as some people would probably say about Saudi in societies like that, they're like a not a divine autocracy, but the power is in the hands of one leader. It's not all nice and how we study in our Western schools, and the power needs to be dispersed, and we need the branches of government and their checks and balances and stuff like that. Islam, that is not spelled out in Islam in that way. And so Islam is more important that there is a leader that is trying to implement Islamic law. And Islamic law, you don't have a choice. You can't say, well, no, we don't want polygamy anymore. No. This is something mashru'. It's from the book and the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, ijma, ulama, the consensus of the scholars. It's not something you cannot say, well, we need to be nicer. We need, there should be allowed gay marriages and gay imams getting their male spouses. No, completely not. Whereas that is what a democratic, because with a democracy, one thing most of those definitions will agree upon is that freedom and that huge role of the constituency. Okay. So what I thought was some interesting observations, and it's just the reality, we live in democratic societies and we generally are more comfortable here. We like having those places. We do. So I think as Salafis, there's a tension there, but again, it's about being able to practice your deen in the best way that you can wherever you are. As Prophet ﷺ mentioned, the hijrah being to that one of the strongest hijrah is a hijrah min ma'asi, is to make your hijrah from your sins. So maybe some people go to a Muslim land and they do more sins than they do in the Western country because of whatever reasons. This happens. Some people find their religion more, but that does not justify. It's still the asl is to make hijrah from a Muslim land to a non-Muslim land, and the scholars pretty much agree that is recommended at least. Okay, some scholars say it's an obligation, but I think the most correct view, as many of our scholars mention, and even anyhow, that it is something recommended. It is better. It's better to live in a Muslim country. But however, if you do not, and you can practice your deen, you're not having your hijab torn off your head, you can wear the niqab. Some place like France has a different status than America and the UK. Okay. And Belgium and all those kind of laws where they're pushing for assimilation and so forth. Allah knows best. That takes a scholar to look and say, hey, you really can't practice your deen there. You got to go. You need to French Muslims? No, because they're moving towards assimilation. But, so there's a lot of things to unpack there. But I hope, what I would say is, Islamically, and definitely Salafis definitely reject the tenets of democracy. And you'll hear so many lectures, how they, speak ill, and they have a different. This comes as again to definitions. That's one of the things I had to spell out because I couldn't just say, well, Sheikh Muqbil said, but rather I do have a statement of Sheikh Muqbil, and and I've heard him say, really harsh against democracy, that this is kufr, and but the definition you find common with a lot of Salafi scholars is basically that it is that it means, you know, everyone, the youth, I mean, you know, everyone rules, you know, group rulership, or everyone has the right in rulership. So the scholars, they really go in on that, and that's their concept of democracy. But I think, you know, it definitely needs more unpacking. But I don't say that it's necessarily Sharia compliant. No, not at all. But I think, you know, just as far as the definition, because then you have those societies like Egypt, and this is kind of what some of the Ikhwan Muslimin and like Morsi and others were pushing for, and even their Salafist parties or whatever, pushing for in a Muslim country to have those democratic principles, you know, and ruling by the Sharia. You know, is that okay if the laws are compliant with the Sharia, but you have a democratic process, you know, which, you know, is a very idealistic situation? Would that be Sharia compliant, you know? And how does that relate to if you have a kingdom, or you have this, or you have that? So is it that framework of government, or is it the actual, that the laws and everything are ruled by the Shara and that process, you know? So Allah knows best. Those are huge masail and questions. And again, a lot of these tensions we're finding as we are Muslim minorities, and large Muslim minorities now throughout the world. There's just we have whole different needs and challenges. But I think one thing we can realize is in a sense, no matter how many institutions we want to establish and this and that and the other, I think generally we can say we are kind of failing. We're failing a lot in all those. You know, when you live as a Muslim minority, you don't have the power. You are a minority. Islamically, there's a lot of compromise. You're forced to compromise, and there's a lot of things you have no choice about, and a lot of munkar, a lot of sins. And the bottom line is, because of the attractions of the freedom, you lose a lot of Muslims. The reality is a lot of Muslims who, you know, we're losing our youth much more rapidly than they are in Muslim countries, you know, on a generally, you know, it's and even our adults, you know. So
I'll come in on that. I think that, Mashallah, Jazakallah khair. Malahat had a question which I'm going to let you deal with after I've addressed this, and I also want to talk, Brother Fahim, wa alaikum salam, Brother Fahim, mashallah, tabarakallah, seeing these brothers and sisters on there. Brother Fahim gave an example of the system in Oman. So Hassan, can you put that back up, please? Brother Fahim's comment, when you can, and then we'll put back up Malahat's one. Yes, so Fahim is saying here, in Oman, they have a kind of hybrid, a nationwide shura council whose members are locally elected, but of course they are advisory only and don't legislate laws for the nation. So that's interesting from the perspective of Oman. And then Malahat's question I'll let you deal with shortly. But you mentioned something there, Khalid, with regards to implementation of the Sharia, and you gave an example, and I want to come back on something that I've been reading in Slavery in Islam by Jonathan Brown, a very extensive book that I'm still going through. Very interesting perspectives he brings, and he refers to, you mentioned about the ruler cannot just suddenly say, okay, polygyny, plural marriage cannot be practiced. But here we have in the annals of Islam, from the Ottoman Empire particularly, and some others, he gave a title here: prohibited by the ruler, but not by Allah. The crucial matter of taqiyid al-mubah, okay, restricting the permissible, okay. And I found this fascinating because it's not saying something is haram, but he said here in one instance, restricting the permissible expanded into a more robust, oft-invoked principle in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in part due to controversial issues like slavery and polygamy. Muhammad Bayram Khamis and later Muhammad Abdul pointed to the ruler's right to restrict the permissible as a key tool needed to abolish slavery. Rida had concurred that Muslim rulers should prohibit slavery if they felt that it was in the best interest of Muslims. Okay, so here, and the statement here that went on to endorse that was, if you can't do it right, you can't do it at all. And in regard to slavery, prohibiting slavery that was poorly done. It was abused. It was something that was being abused by those who were practicing it. Polygyny, plural marriage, polygamy, as some say, was something that was being abused in particular societies, and it was causing ills where the ruler or the leadership would prohibit the permissible, but not say it was haram. And this for me was fascinating, prohibiting the permissible, something that was done in Islamic societies. So I think that's an interesting thing. That is it something that should be revisited? Is it something that it continues to be done in particular societies? We know, like, for example, in Tunisia, they have prohibited. And I remember when I first came to deans, like, how can they, this is halal, how are they making it haram? But we didn't know that they were not making it haram, that they were prohibiting the permissible. Because again, here, if you can't do it right, you can't do it at all. I think that's that for me, that's an interesting context or concept that should be looked at. And I'd be really interested to know what ulama say today concerning that. Because, for example, we see this happened again in Saudi Arabia with those who went into the country with in plural marriage, and then I can't remember when it was, but then they stopped that. They stopped that happening. And they didn't. So some might say, how can they make
it and stuff like that? Yeah,
exactly. You couldn't get ikamas, and even Saudis who were married. Yes, Saudis who were marrying non-Saudis, and they already had a wife in Saudi. The same thing, and I knew particular Saudis as well who wanted to practice this institution of plural marriage, and they couldn't bring the wife that married outside in. They just were not allowed to. It included princes, from what I recall in the time. So prohibiting the permissible. If it can't be done right, it shouldn't be done at all. And I think, as I said, I think this is very interesting if we're looking today at why certain practices are not taking place. And we need to be clear on this when others are saying they're making it haram, something permissible, haram. We need to really determine, is that really what is happening in that case? Because it may be what I've just spoken about here, which is a principle that was there for centuries now, mashallah tabarakallah. And it may not have been something that was there in the classical times at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I don't recall hearing about that principle being implemented or even spoken about or referred to, except in latter years. But what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, again, you know, having someone, you know, it requires no doubt in-depth knowledge of fiqh, but in general, that doesn't sound, you know, and that comes to a difference in methodology. That's definitely not a Salafi concept, you know, that you would, you know, there's no doubt there's fiqh and there's usul of fiqh and there's looking at the harms and the benefits, and all those principles are Islamic principles. But I think, and like, as you mentioned, some of the people, the proponents of that, as you were saying, they're plain and simple, they're far from Salafiyah. They were kind of like modernist and stuff like this.
Right.
And a lot of those laws you find really are but not a backlash, but they were from colonialism anyway. A lot of it is from colonialism and changing the minds of the society, and sometimes colonial lords would change those laws and restrict things and so forth. Right. So that is a lot of the product. The reality is we don't live in a bubble. All of the world has been affected. All the Muslim lands have been affected from colonialism in some form or another, even if they weren't directly colonized, you know, in the mindsets and so forth. And so,
the example is the niqab, just to interject there on what you're saying, in agreement with you. The example is the niqab and how that's become frowned upon even in some Muslim countries.
Yes.
Okay. And taking up that Western narrative that this is repressive and regressive for women and so forth. So therefore you're seeing that there's, while it's not being implemented in the same way that we see in France and other European countries, there's that sort of unspoken reference that of wanting to prohibit the niqab because it's prohibiting the permissible, because that outward colonial pressure that this is backwards and Muslims who are wearing it are backwards, so therefore it shouldn't be worn. And if it hasn't been prohibited in some Muslim countries, it's certainly frowned upon, or the label of extremism, albeit behavioral if they want to refer to it, is being placed upon those who adhere to that, just like the wearing of the beard and the short thobes. And so I agree with you. I find it, as I said, fascinating that that's something that took it took but gathered momentum in these narratives and in some of the Muslim societies.
Yeah.
Okay, in some of the Muslim societies, and it became acceptable from an authoritarian perspective that cascaded down throughout society. But yes, where did that emanate from? That's a good question to investigate and to say, is it something that scholars of that time accepted, or was that more from a government leadership perspective that was introduced? Did it have any scholastic weight behind it? That's a very important thing to look at in that instance.
I think what you find is you'll always find people, and there are those, as some great scholars mentioned about, in the past, about, ulama su, the evil scholars in that sense. You will have those people who justify everything, eating during Ramadan. That Tunisian leader, he came on to national television. He said, our working in our factories is a type of jihad. And so I advise the workers they should not fast this Ramadan. And he came on television and he ate his apple. And the scholar, I think their mufti, I can't remember if he justified it or he disagreed and then he was killed or something like this. This was probably in the 80s or something like this, or 90s. I'm not sure. I remember one of my Tunisian colleagues telling me about that. Anyhow, so the bottom line is you will always find these. I mean, if you go to Azhar and you listen to some of their fatwa, even just Azhar, and other contemporary things, it's going to be drastically different, obviously, than a Salafi perspective, because of the concept of istihlal, because that's exactly what it is. It's making the halal, the permissible, haram, and the haram halal. And as somebody put up the quote, la ta'a fi ma'siyatillah. There's no, as the Prophet ﷺ said, there's no obedience in disobedience to Allah.
Right.
Okay? And, it goes against such an important foundation of Islam. Now, being able to arbitrate it, to kind of maybe some restrictions and, putting some, okay, you need a certain license for polygamy, or it's not that we're saying it's haram or something, but for this reason, maybe they have an illah in their society that they put some other obstacles or something like that. I think it's different than just totally prohibiting it, like many societies. The bottom line is polygamy is not permissible. I don't know if legally in Egypt, if you can marry more than one, I don't know. I'm not sure, but even though people practice polygamy, but I know Tunisia and many other Muslim societies, or several others, and there's all kind of things going on there. And this feeds the other extremists who make takfir of them and say they're disbelievers, they're ruling by other than what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed. And maybe there is some element of that, no doubt. And there's no doubt there's wicked sins and there's oppression and there's all kind of things going on. And
but then, Khalid, that on that principle, though, that same principle that we're speaking about was used as a rationale to abolish slavery. Okay, or not to abolish. I don't want to, because that's making it haram, and there's a discussion around that to be had. But to stop slavery in Muslim societies, and no one would argue with that, except again the extremists who then tried to implement what they understood slavery to be with the Yazidis and the brutal implementation of what they did not so long ago. But as we're drawing to a conclusion of this show, Hassan, if you can put up Malahat's question, but the thing I want to come to as well with regards to classical solutions, Khalid, and it's something that revolutionized the prophetic society. So remember that question from Malahat, Brother Khalid. I'm going to get you to answer that if you don't mind, inshallah. But what revolutionized the society at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we need to really look at this on an individual level to understand its magnitude on a comprehensive societal global level. And that was none other than Tawheed and understanding Tawheed. And many speak about Tawheed almost as a slogan now and refer to the 99 plus one names that Allah has revealed to us of his Asma wa Sifat. And I want to refer to another, mashallah, student of knowledge, scholar in his own right, and that's Sheikh Tahir Wyatt, and the lectures that he did on Tawheed, okay, which are available. If you look for Wyatt's Wisdom, WYATTS Wisdom, a YouTube channel that someone's put up for him, and you go to his series on Tawheed. Now, I would say in the Western vernacular language, to this day, I have not heard lectures that have actualized Tawheed for us as lay people to implement in our lives, in whichever society we're in, particularly the Western society, as I have those lectures. And anyone I've referred them to, it's been absolutely profound. Okay. Likewise, similarly, lessons on the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam by Abu Hanifa Rafai, okay, a British brother from my community, from the Brixton community, and how he brings the seerah, and he bases it on revelation, mashallah tabarakallah, and he brings it into contemporary context. Why am I bringing these things? Because we're talking about Tawheed, we're talking about the seerah, we're talking about these being foundational as well as comprehensive aspects of learning to understand why classical solutions, why things as rudimentary, as fundamental of what I was just referred to, Tawheed and the seerah, will help us with contemporary problems that we have on an individual, personal level in the first instance. We're not talking remote, externally referenced. We're talking on an individual level initially. And in implementing things, once we've actualized Tawheed, in implementing the Sunnah and understanding how to apply it contemporarily, this is the first step towards rectification. This is the first step, Khalid. I know that you agree with me on that because we're always referring to that. We go academic, but we have to come back to the rudimentary, fundamental aspects there. And why do I say that Tawheed was revolutionary? Let's look at what the Quraysh did to suppress this message, understanding the import of what would take place if this Tawheed took root in their society. And what it did is it toppled an infrastructure, a society. We saw a superpower at the time, the Abyssinian society, the Negus, the leader of that society, recognized the efficacy of the message, so much so that he, the head of state, embraced Islam.
No.
So if we want to understand how we're going to deal with things now, we need to return to that ourselves and eschew and shun the slogans and using Islam as a sloganistic message, and really actualize Tawheed in the way that I heard it being taught. Our scholars teach this, but I'm saying for the Western mind to understand, when you're talking about Allah being Al-Alim, when you're talking about Al-Rahman, and you're looking at all of this, and you're looking at these attributes and knowing how they impact in your life first and foremost, and how they can impact in society, that is how we then begin to understand and comprehend that classical solutions really can deal with the contemporary problems of this age. And I hand it over to you before we conclude, inshallah.
Jazakallah khairan. Yeah, that was something I was looking at prior to this this talk, and that we need practical implementation of Tawheed, and that isn't about just rattling off the 3 categories of Tawheed, memorizing terms and so forth without any practice, But we can't belittle the importance of Tawheed and the importance of Iman in our faith in establishing community. And I know in our other discussion that we had in the other podcast or what have you, the streaming that we did, where one of the participants was concerned about, was really discussing about solutions in, for example, the African American community, the non-Muslim community, and was kind of looking at, it seemed to me, more un-Islamic solutions, more looking outside, or kind of thinking that it was a little bit too just a term, Tawheed, and that's it. No, what we're talking about is the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum ajma'in came from a society where they were bearing babies alive. Okay. They came from a society that was, they just killed each other relentlessly. So yeah, we can go to Detroit, we can go to many American cities, and there's indiscriminate killing. I'm in New Mexico. The Mexican gangs, they, will do something to you, cut your head off and mail it to your mother. They do this, the cartels especially. So the point is we have those brutality, and still Islam has that same solution, that Iman, establishing that for us as Muslims is going to help have a greater impact on society, because it's in line with the purpose of creation. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I've not created mankind and the jinn except for the purpose of worshiping me. So letting us know that that's our divine purpose. The Muslim always has a purpose to wake up and shouldn't be confused about that, but it requires implementing that, not just knowing that on a periphery thing, but it requires implementing. And we saw the transformation in the Sahaba, and that they were building Iman for how many years? Well, we don't really do that in a lot of our communities, especially all of our communities in the West, but especially a lot of our Salafi communities too. New Muslims are not working on their spirituality and how to be better inward. They're more concerned with the outward. Okay, sister, I know you embraced Islam yesterday. You need a niqab and you need a full jilbab. And so she literally was dancing on the pole last night, and now she's a Muslim. And like the same week she's wearing niqab and stuff. So there's no connect in that spiritual connection. So of course, how are you going to change behavior? How are you going to affect Iman and so forth? I mean, these are complex, huge issues, but really the Iman and dealing with the as many of the scholars mention, that the way the shaitan comes to you is in two ways: through your shubahat or your shahwat, through your doubts, either doubts about the religion, a lack of yaqeen and this and kind of so forth, or through other ideologies and bid'ah, heresy and other foreign ideologies and philosophy and this and that and the other, to where you leave Islam through your creed. You don't even really believe in Islam, or you contradict most of his Islamic principles because you don't study Islam, you don't know anything about Islam. That's one way. The second way is through ma'asi, is through sinfulness, through, we are in the West, so we're engaged. We can go out, maybe you go down the block and there's a strip club right there, and there's liquor stores all around the place, or whatever. There's so much sin we're immersed in, and our children are bombarded with in schools, and the whole society and social media and what have you. So we have so many challenges. And the way to deal with a lot of that poison is, Imam Ibn al-Qayyim has a whole beautiful book called, about the medicine, the spiritual cure, basically, that is really it. It's really is. I mean, how do you stay focused in a society like this, except that you have to be working on your spirituality. You have to be building your Iman to keep you away from following your desires. You want to have a girlfriend. You want to have a boyfriend. You want to have multiple girlfriends. You want to maybe try a little bit of medical marijuana or other marijuana, whatever. But what's going to restrict you from that? Because no one else, there is no Sharia. There's no Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar. There's no command in the good and the forbidding the evil, but rather it's going to be your Iman. And so that is a way, and it's going back to the classical solutions, that we need to establish that in our communities. And that doesn't contradict calling people to Islam, and it doesn't contradict giving charity to communities, and doesn't contradict having open houses in the communities and food banks and whatever else. It doesn't contradict donating blood. All of that is good, especially with the intention to give dawah, and especially to benefit other human beings. This is all khair. This is all something mashru'. It's legislated in the shar'. So we have a lot of work to do everywhere, in establishing our Iman on a community level. And this comes through Islamic education, and it comes through practice, not just, you got the book and you read the titles, and mashallah, it was such a nice dars and it felt so good, but it's actually crying to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and praying to Allah tabarak wa ta'ala and making tawbah to Allah all the time, constant repentance, and actually implementing tawheed, knowing, as the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, first and foremost, Inna Allah la yakhfa alayhi shay'un fil ardi wala fis sama. Verily, nothing is hidden from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the heavens and earth. So we know Allah sees you when you go to the liquor store, when you watch pornography, when you do this. So if you know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees you, you really know it. Not that you study the categories, not that you read the books, not that you sat in a tafsir class, but you implement that, then that's what's going to protect you from looking at that when no one else is around, or involving yourself in whatever when no one else is around. So that's what I believe, that spiritual base is so important. And getting to the sister's question about how do Salafis choose a leader, I think it would be more appropriate to say, how does Islam choose a leader? Okay, Islamically, the way is through shura. You know, how's a leader elected according to Salafis? There really isn't a particular Salafi way that goes against what the Salafi way is, what Imam Abu Hanifa said, and what Imam Malik said, and what Imam Shafi'i said, and what Imam Ahmed said. Well, غيرهم كثير. And you know, first and foremost with the Sahaba and the Tabi'in, which by Tabi'in, and Imam Abu Hanifa was from maybe a Tabi'i. So anyhow, the point is, what does Islam say? Well, one of the ways that you'll find in all the fiqh books when they talk about those kind of higher issues about the leadership is that through shura, you know, it's through shura, you know, some sort of process of consultation, which we were kind of talking about in the beginning. And then another way is that if through ghalaba, that if actually, for example, if ISIS, no matter how much we hate them, but if they had taken over Sardiya, say, for example, they came into Sardiya and they got rid of the king, and they actually, and Abu Bakr Baghdadi and whoever else, no matter how much we dislike them, had taken security over the country, he is now the leader, Islamically. Because that is what the fuqaha talked about. That is through ghalaba. So if someone else takes that authority, even if they were Khariji before, and they were this and that and the other, and it was not a good means, but that is one of the things that you'll find in the books of fiqh. And I don't know anyone
like the top more recently, like what happened with the Taliban retaking Afghanistan.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
it's they are the authority. You know, I mean, there's resistance to them, but now they are the government authority. So, you know, the society Islamically needs to be, the world's going to have their own view. People in Afghanistan are going to have their own views. They may not like them, but, you know, they are the ones in charge now. So those are two of the ways that I can think of right off the get-go. It's mainly through shura, and it's through, as they say, ghalaba, you know, like that, if it was through fighting or whatever. And that doesn't encourage rebelling and stuff. Isn't shura democratic? No, we talked about that in the beginning. If you came late, that democracy as a whole system, a whole set of principles, just because there's shura, which is the consultation, is not really, it really, even our supposed democratic system. Look at America and the Electoral College. Okay, there's so many there's a lot of differences anyway. So no, isn't shura democratic? Well, isn't democracy have a link with a shura? You might be able to argue that, but and then there's whole groups who believe that wholeheartedly. But really, when we look at the definitions that are proposed, especially in contemporary concepts about democracy, you know, it's the rule of the people, and by the people, for the people. It is a whole list of freedoms that Islam doesn't necessarily give you all those freedoms. Islam doesn't give you those freedoms. It's not intrinsically democratic. The Prophet ﷺ didn't ask the Sahaba, should we change this and make this halal, and should we make this haram? La. He received revelation, and that was the way it was. And what distinguishes us between the Sahaba and the classical scholars and the scholars up until now that follow that way is that they believe in ittiba. They believed in following. Oh, Allah said this. The Prophet ﷺ said this. This is the way to do it. Khalas. I'm not going to debate it. I'm not going to argue it. I'm not going to try to explain it away. Whereas we are very influenced, and throughout history, and even the groups that deviated from the path, you know, philosophy, excuse me, was a big part of that process to where their ideas and their opinions and so forth. The Sahaba, no, they weren't really interested in opinions. They'd ask the Prophet ﷺ, what does this mean, when he was alive? And after him, they emphasized the importance of ittiba, ittiba, laysa ibtida, following strictly, not innovating in the religion, not coming up with a new principle. And they were so stern about that because they knew that was the preservation of Islam. What would we have if we allowed all these other, all the groups, everyone in their opinions? And we've seen the destruction in many societies and to people. Because
what I want to sticking with Brother Reactionary, mashallah, and Jazakallah, Brother Reaction, you throw out some of the challenging questions. He's saying, with respect to you, saying all he hears is words from us. It's the same thing for the last 30 years. He mentions that there are people having abortions. Now, as an example,
excuse me for just 1 second. I'm listening. Go ahead.
Yeah. So basically, Brother Reactionary, if we haven't talked about classical solutions to contemporary problems and highlighted what they are to address some of the problems that we're looking at today, I'm not quite sure what it is that you are expecting as an answer or a point of action to address. I respect what you're saying because we've heard so many discussions. And I said that at the beginning, from the outset, that we don't want to deal with rhetoric. We don't want to deal with slogans. And we've given, not saying that we have all the answers, but from the perspective of talking about Tawheed, from the perspective of looking about actualizing the practice, not taking things in abstract and theorizing around them and just talking about theory and being idealistic and wearing rose-tinted glasses. We're not speaking about that. There are many deficiencies in our approach and application to aspects of the deen today. There are many, and we have to acknowledge those. I refer to one of the theoretical frameworks that I developed in my PhD, the funnel theory, where we're seeing the positioning of particular groups and ideologies in a societal perspective. And in doing that study, I acknowledge that Salafis, for example, are positioned to deal with a particular aspect societally of the religion. Some may disagree with me on that. I believe that's where we're best suited with regards to theology, expounding theology, the dawah, combating extremist narratives. But do we have the solution, and do we have not just the solution, do we have the infrastructure and the ability to deal with all the other aspects that are required as Muslims to contribute to society? And I'll be honest and say, no, we don't. I think there are too many problems among us as Salafis to even address that. That's not talking about Salafiyah, though, which Salafiyah is synonymous with Islam. Does Islam have all the answers and solutions to society? Absolutely. Absolutely. But there are myriad groups who are calling to various aspects of Islam and therefore not being able to provide that comprehensive solution. And even more so, they're not referring to classical solutions. And if they are, they've distorted them one way or the other. And yes, very good question. This is why we're talking about frameworks, Reactionary, and we're looking at our research. Don't we need a practical framework to build our ummah? We do, and we have one. And we were drawing to a conclusion by speaking about the revolutionary prophetic model of what occurred that dismantled society based on debauchery, immorality, shirk at that time. And it's only that will address what we are facing today now. Societies that we're living in, the imperialist societies, the Western societies, socialist, capitalist societies, communist societies, you name all of those isms. And they need to be dismantled. I've said this in my articles. I say it now here unashamedly. They need to be dismantled in the similar way or same way that we saw Tawheed, the message of Tawheed, dismantle that society. We saw the message of Tawheed, of the Anbiya, and what it did to challenge the societies of that time that were steeped in immoral practices, and shirk, above all shirk. So the framework's there, my brother. It's about how to, or sister, I don't know if reaction is a male or female, F1, brother or sister, I'm assuming it's a brother. It's the framework is there, and it's about how it is applied today. But as an ummah, we are not united on the foundational aspects of our deen to even begin to contemplate that implementation. And brother Khalid, unless there's something you want to add, we've gone into 1 hour 15 minutes. Very engaging discussion today, and the comments as usual from our brothers and sisters and guests who are viewing, very engaging, mashallah. But I will conclude on that particular aspect and hand over to you if there's anything else you want to add.
I basically agree with what you said. Our framework is Islam. Now, a practical framework, I don't know what you mean by that. You know, again, that would require you really explaining in depth and maybe giving some examples. What do you mean by a practical framework? Isn't Islam that practical framework? We pray 5 times a day. We have a methodology of how to practice Islam, and that gives us the tools to be able to practice Islam wherever we are. You know, to practice Islam in almost under most circumstances. If you're lost in a plane crash in the desert, you're still going to practice Islam. If you are living in China as a Uyghur, you're going to practice Islam to the best of your ability. You're oppressed. You're living in Burma, you're living, you know, whatever the case may be, in Sweden, you're living in France, you know, you're practicing Islam to the best of your ability. So that is giving you those personal frameworks. Don't we need a documented constitution? Well, based on the book and the Sunnah and that which goes against it, I think you're looking at it from a prism, a Western paradigm, you know, the separation of powers, and we need this and this and that and the other. That's what you're coming up with, because there's many other governments that don't really have necessarily all those same types of institutions and in the same way. So we don't need Western democracy. We don't need that. We just need to practice Islam in the context of our societies, as long as the principles and the, I guess, what is written as a constitution in the laws are not contradicting Islam. Okay. That is our general framework right there. But to say, yes, we need the separation of powers. We need this for government. And it seems to me, and when you talked about an ummah, I don't know. That sounds, what you're talking to me is just the government. And the government is only a small part, really, of the Muslim ummah. So I'm not really sure.
And good. I think, mashallah, reaction. He's putting up some reaction.
And we kind of talked about that already too.
Yeah,
you know, that as long as it doesn't contradict the Sharia, as long as it doesn't contradict the Sharia. But again, those are big concepts and compliant form of democratic representation. I don't know, you know, what you see actually in some of the Muslim societies, like that are, I guess, if you want to say more authoritarian in that nature, even Saudi and stuff, is that, and as the commenter mentioned about Oman, the same thing in Saudi as well. I remember in Medina when they started to have representatives. So they have that same thing in Saudi and so forth, and in different cities, and now maybe even women might be a part of those things.
That's
but
right.
They don't really have any real, they don't have any real power or anything like this. But there's kind of this push, you know, it's just, it's an effect of the world in the context of the time we live in, you know, of the push, the onslaught of democracy and the onslaught of other foreign ideologies. But so I think, you know, the way I look at it, now this is more of a personal and kind of what I concluded in my research, is that, again, you're trying to practice Islam the best you can. And most places, all places, are imperfect. And as I said before, in my view, I see Saudi Arabia as the most Islamically compliant place in the world, regardless of their shortcomings. But, you know, you can't compare America, or you can't compare Malaysia, or you can't compare Indonesia or any other thing to Saudi Arabia. No place you can compare it. You know, the implementation of the Salat and just so many things, you know, of trying to rule by the book and the Sunnah and all the blessings of Mecca and Medina, and just so many things we could talk about. But so even with the shortcomings, there's so much that is Islamically compliant, and you will, you know, those things are just really big and really outside of our scope, in getting in depth about that.
Yeah, I think, and I think that's a very important point there. Reactionary and vigilant. I can't remember the name was mentioned some very pertinent observations as well. Vigilant stranger. Yes, it's incredibly hard, not impossible, but because secularism has taken over the world. Very true, vigilant stranger. But one thing, and I think we can conclude on that Brother Khalid has said, some of the things we're touching upon, you'll see not a hesitancy. I think we've been open to engage on things, but we do know our limitation and limitations, should I say. And some of the areas that are being raised are beyond our scope. And this is the one thing I think that many of us need to really look at and acknowledge. MashaAllah, Brother Khalid, Dr. Khalid has his PhD in his field, and he's a student of knowledge. I have my PhD in my field, and I'm a simple layman, and I'm not saying that to feign piety. That's the reality. I'm not a student of knowledge in the way of doing the Talib al-Ilm that Khalid and the brothers have done. But we know how to stick within our boundaries and our field. We've learned that, and we know how to stay in our lane. And this is a problem with us as Muslims today. There are so many speaking beyond their remit, speaking without knowledge, which causes harm. Without doubt, it causes harm. So some of the things that have been touched upon today, Reactionaries brought some really pertinent questions, but they're beyond the scope of our knowledge, and it will be, I think, unwise of us to even try and proffer responses beyond what we've already responded to. And knowing your level, as we always try to do, all of us, yourselves and us, is, I hope, something that we should always keep at the forefront of our mind when it extends beyond where our remit can take us to, inshallah. We've gone on longer, and we occasionally do that to address some of the points that were raised. I want to say Jazakumullah khair. I want to say thank you to all those who've come. We've got new viewers, Nadia, Simple Life, Sister Jazakumullah khair for joining us and everything. Our usual brothers and sisters, we always welcome you. Vigilant Stranger, Haqq, you coming on board. And until the next time, which will be a fortnight, where we'll be looking at other subjects that are pertinent and looking at them through a Haqq, Sister Leda, looking through from a perspective that's academic and academia, and you're welcome, Reactionary. Thank you for your challenging questions and points, as always. We really do appreciate them, as you can see, even if we can't engage with them to the depth that satisfies you, mashallah. So Jazakallah khair for that. But we look forward to seeing you all and speaking with you all in 2 weeks. We hope not to keep it as long as it's gone today, inshallah. If there are any other questions or points of observation that you've made, please do send them into Stream Islam, and we can address them the next time we come on board. And until that time, until 2 weeks' time, I will say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and take care. And we look forward to seeing you soon. Brother Khalid, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.